What you're about to hear isn't a fairy tale. It happened at one of the most exclusive charity galas in New York City, where a single plate of food costs more than a month's rent. A line was crossed. We'll take you inside the Grand Historia Ballroom, where a billionaire heir, Preston Montgomery III, fueled by arrogance and cheap champagne, publicly tried to destroy a young waitress with a $10,000 dare. He thought his money could buy him a moment of cruel entertainment. He was wrong. What he didn't know was that he wasn't just daring a waitress, he was challenging a forgotten prodigy. Stick with us for a story of humiliation, breathtaking talent, and the moment one woman turned her spotlight of shame into a stage of triumph. The air in the Grand Historia Ballroom was thick with the scent of money and lies. It was a suffocating perfume, a mixture of expensive cologne, vintage Chanel. No, I'd a faint, sweet decay of thousands of hothouse flowers flown in from the Netherlands. For the guests, it was the smell of Tuesday. For Cassandra Riley, it was the smell of another 16-hour shift on her feet. Cassie, as she was known to the few people who bothered to learn her name, moved through the glittering chaos with a practiced economy of motion. Her black and white uniform was impeccably starched, a stark contrast to the vibrant silks and shimmering satins of the women she served. Her tray, laden with flutes of Dom Perignon, was an extension of her arm, steady, balanced, and invisible. That was the job, to be an efficient, silent ghost who materialized with champagne and vanished before her presence could register. Tonight was the annual St. Jude's Children's Foundation, an event where New York's elite gathered to congratulate themselves on their generosity by bidding on things they didn't need. Cassie had worked dozens of these events. She knew the rhythm, the polite chatter that would grow louder and less coherent as the night wore on, the air kisses that never landed, the strained smiles that didn't reach the surgically perfected eyes. She navigated past a woman draped in what looked like $1 million diamond necklace, its fire catching the light from the crystal chandeliers. The woman was laughing a brittle, high-pitched sound at something a portly man with a glistening forehead had said. They didn't see Cassie. No one did. She was part of the machinery of the evening, as functional and unregarded as a well-oiled hinge on a service door. Her manager, a perpetually stressed but kind woman named Mrs. Genevieve Peterson, had given her a brief pep talk earlier. Head up, Riley. These people can smell fear. Just be polite, be efficient, and for God's sake, don't engage. Engage! As if Cassie had the energy for it. Her feet were already aching in her sensible non-slip shoes. Her mind was a million miles away, replaying the rejection letter that had arrived that morning. It was the third one this month. The Donovan Academy of Performing Arts Alumni Grant Committee regrets to inform you. The words were burned into her memory. 4 years. It had been 4 years since the accident. 4 years since she'd traded her point shoes for a serving tray. Her dreams of the Broadway stage for the reality of rent and her mother's medical bills. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between serving tables, she could still feel it. The phantom sensation of the stage lights on her skin, the thrum of the orchestra and the floorboards, the collective held breath of an audience just before the music began. It was a ghost limb, an ache for a life that was no longer hers. She was refilling water glasses at table 12 when she first felt the weight of a specific, targeted gaze. It wasn't the usual indifferent sweep of the room. This was focused, dissecting, and laced with a palpable sense of contempt. She looked up, her professional smile faltering for a fraction of a second. The eyes belonged to Preston Montgomery III. Even if you didn't know the name, you knew the type. He was handsome in the way that only generations of wealth and privilege can sculpt a strong jaw, perfectly coiffed sandy blonde hair, a Rolex on his wrist that cost more than her car. He was lounging in his chair, not sitting, with the easy entitlement of a man who had never been told no in his life. He was the heir to the Montgomery CPS real estate empire, a dynasty that had plastered its name on half the skyscrapers in Manhattan. He was flanked by his entourage. On his right was his fiancée, Veronica Davenport, a woman so thin and polished she looked like she might shatter if you spoke too loudly. Her smile was a slash of crimson lipstick, and her eyes, as she watched Cassie, held a bored cruelty. On his left were two sycophants Cassie mentally dubbed Chad and Bryce. They were laughing at something Preston had just murmured, their braying laughter a perfect chorus of agreement. Preston's gaze lingered on Cassie. He wasn't looking at her, but through her, as if she were a curious specimen of insect he'd found crawling on his fine china. He nudged Veronica. "Look at this one," he said, his voice a low drawl. That still carried in a lull in the conversation. "They look like they're wound by a key, don't they, little automatons?" Veronica tittered. "Don't be cruel, darling. She's just trying to earn her tip." Cassie's jaw tightened, but she kept pouring the water, her movements deliberate and smooth. "Don't engage. Be a ghost." She finished the last glass and began to retreat, her back straight, her dignity her only shield. "Excuse me." Preston's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "You missed a spot." Cassie paused, turning back. "Sir." He pointed a manicured finger at his water glass. There, on the pristine white tablecloth, was a single, minuscule bead of water. It was no bigger than a pinhead. "There," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "You spilled. Slocky work." The accusation hung in the air, absurd and insulting. Chad and Bryce snickered. Veronica watched with predatory amusement. It was a power play, a small act of dominance to entertain his court. Cassie felt a hot flush of anger rise up her neck. All day she had endured the condescension, the dismissive waves of a hand, the sheer invisibility. This tiny, deliberate cruelty was the final straw. But Mrs. Peterson's voice echoed in her head, "Don't engage." She took a breath. "My sincerest apology, sir. I'll get a cloth to rectify that immediately." Her voice was a marvel of professional calm, but Preston wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his blue eyes glinting with a mean-spirited spark. "Rectify it. I don't think a cloth is going to rectify the general atmosphere of incompetence here tonight." He took a long sip of his champagne, then set the glass down with a soft click. The band on the main stage had just finished a slow jazz number and was transitioning into something more vibrant, a fiery, complex piece of tango neo. The staccato rhythm of the bandoneon began to fill the ballroom. Preston's smirk widened into a grin. He had an idea, a brilliant, terrible idea. "You know," he said, his voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear, "I have a proposition for you." Cassie stood frozen. She could feel the eyes of other guests turning towards their table, sensing the brewing drama. "My friends and I were just discussing how utterly devoid of passion people are these days," Preston announced, gesturing vaguely at the room. "Everyone's so stiff, so lifeless." His gaze landed squarely back on Cassie. "I'll bet you've never felt a moment of real passion in your life, have you?" Her silence was his answer. He stood up, a towering figure of bespoke tailoring and inherited arrogance. "I dare you," he said. "I dare you to dance with me right here, right now, to this." A collective gasp rippled through the nearby tables. Veronica's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine surprise before settling back into amusement. This was better than she'd expected. "Preston, don't be absurd." She purred a weak protest, designed only to spur him on. "I'm not being absurd, I'm making a point," he declared. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick monogrammed money clip. He peeled off a stack of $100 bills, the crisp notes fanning out in his hand. He didn't count them, but Cassie could see it was a staggering amount. $10,000, he announced to the silent watching room. "That's your tip if you can dance this tango with me and not make a complete fool of yourself. But if you stumble, if you fall, if you can't keep up, you get nothing, and you're fired. He looked over at a pale-faced Mrs. Peterson who was rushing towards their table. I'll personally see to it. It was the ultimate act of humiliation, a public spectacle designed for her to fail. He, a man who had likely had private lessons for every conceivable activity, versus her, a lowly waitress in orthopedic shoes. The power imbalance was sickening. He wasn't just daring her to dance. He was daring her to exist outside of her designated role, knowing she would be destroyed in the attempt. Cassie's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to melt back into the shadows. But then she looked at his face, the smug certainty, the utter contempt. She saw every rejection letter, every condescending glance, every moment she had been forced to swallow her pride. And she thought of the ghost limb, the phantom ache of the stage. She looked at the $10,000. It was an insulting sum, a bribe for her own humiliation. But it was also 2 years of her mother's medication. It was a security deposit on a better apartment. It was a lifeline. But it wasn't the money that made her decide. It was his eyes. It was the absolute conviction in them that she was nothing. Across the room, a young freelance photographer named Nathaniel Crow, hired to capture candid shots of the wealthy guests, lowered his camera. He had been watching the interaction. His lens initially focused on Preston Montgomery as a prime target for the society pages, but his focus had shifted to the waitress. He saw the flicker of defiance in her eyes, the subtle squaring of her shoulders. He lifted his camera again, adjusted the focus, and leaned against a pillar. He had...
Okay, she felt this was about to become the most interesting thing to happen all night. Cassie took a slow, deliberate breath, the chaotic noise of the ballroom fading into a dull roar. Her gaze met Preston's, and for the first time that night, her professional mask dissolved, replaced by a cool, unreadable calm. "Okay," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I accept." A shocked silence fell over the surrounding tables, so profound that the sharp syncopated rhythm of the tango suddenly seemed deafening. Preston Montgomery III's arrogant grin faltered for just a moment, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't actually expected her to accept. The dare was about the refusal, the confirmation of his power to intimidate her into submission. Her acceptance changed the game. But his ego, a vast and well-fed beast, quickly recovered. Of course she'd accepted. For $10,000, what desperate little nobody wouldn't? This would be even more amusing than he'd imagined. "Excellent!" he boomed, clapping his hands together once. "A little spirit. I like it." He gestured grandly to the small open space between the tables. "The stage is yours." "Ours," he corrected himself with a smirk. Veronica Davenport laughed, a sound like ice cubes clinking in a crystal glass. "Oh, Preston, you are terrible," she said, though her eyes shone with giddy anticipation. She was already picturing the story she would tell at brunch tomorrow. Mrs. Peterson finally reached the table, her face ashen. "Mr. Montgomery, please," she pleaded in a low, urgent whisper. "This is highly inappropriate. Cassandra, go back to the kitchen now." Cassie didn't look at her manager. Her eyes were locked on Preston. "It's all right, Mrs. Peterson," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "He made a public offer. I gave a public acceptance." Mrs. Peterson looked from Preston's smug face to Cassie's unnervingly calm one and knew she had lost control of the situation. To interfere further would only create a bigger scene, potentially jeopardizing her own job. She took a step back, wringing her hands, her expression of pure dread. Cassie's movements were slow and deliberate. First, she placed her silver tray on a nearby service stand, her hands perfectly steady. The room watched, mesmerized by this small, defiant act. Then she reached behind her back and untied the strings of her starched white apron. She folded it neatly, once, twice, and placed it on the tray next to the champagne flutes. It was a symbolic shedding of her uniform, a disrobing of her servitude. Beneath the apron, she wore a simple, well-fitting black blouse and black trousers, the standard uniform. But without the apron, with her posture suddenly straighter, she seemed different, taller. The uniform was no longer a costume of subservience. It was just clothes. Finally, she looked down at her feet, at the sensible, clunky black shoes that had carried her for miles across marble floors. She kicked one off, then the other. The soft thud of the shoes hitting the plush carpet was the only sound. Now she stood in her simple black socks. A murmur went through the crowd. This was no longer just a rich man being a bully. This was turning into theater. Across the room, Nate Crow adjusted his lens. He zoomed in, capturing the details, the folded apron, the discarded shoes, the look of intense concentration on Cassie's face. This wasn't just a story about a dare anymore. It was about a transformation. He held his breath, his finger hovering over the shutter button. Preston, enjoying the attention, offered Cassie his hand with a flourish of mock chivalry. "Shall we?" Cassie ignored his hand. She walked past him to the center of the small, improvised dance floor. She closed her eyes for a single fleeting second. In that darkness, the ballroom melted away. The scent of lilies and champagne was replaced by the familiar smell of rosin and old wood. The chatter of the elite faded, replaced by the echo of her old instructor's voice. Feel the music, Cassandra. Don't just hear it. Let it move you from the inside out. She opened her eyes. The music, Astor Piazzolla's Libertondo, was halfway through its introduction, its melody a seductive, dangerous promise. She knew this piece. She had choreographed a solo to it for her final project at Donovan, a project she never got to perform. She turned to face Preston, her expression no longer calm, but alive. A fire had been lit in her dark eyes. "Ready when you are," she said. Preston strode toward her, confidence rolling off him in waves. He grabbed her hand and pulled her into a traditional tango frame. His grip too tight, his posture stiff. He was a textbook dancer, the kind who learns by memorizing steps, not by feeling the rhythm. He intended to lead, to dominate the dance, just as he dominated everything else. He launched into a basic forward ooh, a simple figure-8 step, expecting her to follow clumsily. And for the first 2 steps, she did. She allowed him to push her, to guide her, her body following his rigid lead. He smirked at Veronica, a self-satisfied, "I told you so" look on his face. This was going to be easy. And then, everything changed. On the 3rd step, as he prepared to pivot, Cassie, didn't just follow, she anticipated. Her frame, which had been pliant, suddenly became charged with energy. Her hand on his back was no longer a follower's touch, it was a guide's. Instead of letting him muscle her through the turn, she used his own momentum, spinning with a speed and precision that caught him completely off guard. He stumbled just for a second, his perfect posture broken. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a flash of confusion. The Bandinian wailed, and Cassie came alive. She was no longer Cassie Riley, the waitress. She was Cassandra, the dancer. Her feet, clad only in black socks, slid across the carpet with a grace her clunky shoes had hidden. She wasn't just doing steps, she was interpreting the music, her body a physical manifestation of the tango's passionate, sorrowful soul. Preston tried to regain control, attempting a more complex sequence of steps he'd no doubt learned for $500 an hour. He led her into a juro, a turn. But she wasn't just turning, she embellished it, her free leg hooking around his in a swift, sharp gancho that was both technically brilliant and breathtakingly audacious. It wasn't in his textbook. He froze for a microsecond, his mind unable to process the move. The crowd, which had been watching with morbid curiosity, was now utterly silent, their champagne flutes forgotten. They were witnessing something they didn't understand. The power dynamic had inverted. The millionaire was no longer leading. He was struggling to keep up. Cassie saw the panic in his eyes, the beads of sweat forming on his brow, and she felt a surge of something fierce and wild. This wasn't about the money anymore. This was for every dream she'd had to defer, for every indignity she'd had to swallow. This was her stage, and he was just a prop. She began to lead subtly at first, then with undeniable authority. She guided him backwards, her steps intricate and sure, forcing him into sequences he clearly didn't know. He was flailing, his movements becoming jerky and reactive. He was a marionette, and she was pulling the strings. Nate Crow was shooting in a frenzy, the rapid click, click, click of his camera, the only counter rhythm to the music. He captured the look of shock on Veronica's face, her crimson smile frozen in a riches of disbelief. He captured the dropped jaws of Chad and Bryce, but mostly he captured Cassie. He framed a shot of her back arched in a perfect expressive line. He caught the moment she dipped her hair brushing the floor, her eyes burning with intensity as she looked up at the floundering man in her arms. The music swelled to its crescendo. Cassie executed a series of lightning-fast foot swivels, a lap drawing invisible circles on the floor around Preston's clumsy feet. She was dancing circles around him, literally and figuratively. For the finale, she drove him back one last time, then spun away from him, her arms snapping out in a dramatic pose, her chest heaving, her chin held high. The final discordant chord of the tango hung in the air like a question mark. Preston was left standing alone in the middle of the space, breathing heavily, his face a mottled red mask of fury and humiliation. He looked lost. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. The entire ballroom, hundreds of people, had stopped to watch. Then one person began to clap. Then two, and then the room erupted. It wasn't polite society applause. It was a roar, a standing ovation from people who had paid $25,000 a table, all for a waitress in black socks. The applause crashed over Cassie in waves, a sound she hadn't heard directed at her in years. It was overwhelming, a physical force that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. For a moment, she was back at the Donegan Academy showcase, taking her final bow after a grueling performance. The adrenaline, the exhaustion, the pure, unadulterated joy of connecting with an audience, it flooded her system sharp and potent. But this wasn't the Academy. She opened her eyes, the illusion shattering, and saw the sea of stunned, wealthy faces. She saw Mrs. Peterson, her hands clasped over her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. She saw Nate Crow, the photographer, lowering his camera with a look of profound awe on his face. And she saw Preston Montgomery III. The roar of the crowd was a judgment against him, and he knew it. The mottled red of his face deepened to a furious crimson. The smirk, the confidence, the entitlement, all of it had been stripped away, leaving behind the raw, ugly core of his arrogance. He had been made a fool of in front of his peers, the very people whose opinions he valued above all else. And by whom? A servant. The applause began to die down as Preston took a step forward. The air crackled with a new dangerous tension.
His eyes, which had been confused and panicked during the dance, were now filled with pure, unadulterated hatred. He reached into his pocket, his movements jerky and violent. He pulled out the money clip again, but this time there was no flourish. He ripped the stack of $10,000 from the clip and with a vicious flick of his wrist, threw the money at Cassie. The bills fluttered through the air, scattering at her feet like expensive, insulting confetti. "There's your tip," he spat, his voice low and venomous. "You wanted a spectacle? You got one. Now get out of my sight."